What if the world's most powerful air force just walked into a trap it cannot walk out of?
Somewhere in the deserts of the Middle East, missiles are flying both ways, and the side everyone assumed was the underdog just changed the entire shape of the fight. Before we go further, if you want to actually understand what's happening instead of just watching headlines fly past you, hit that like button right now. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people who need to see this. Subscribe if you're new, and if you know someone who still thinks this war is simple,
it genuinely helps this channel reach more people who need to see this.
Subscribe if you're new, and if you know someone who still thinks this war is simple, send them this video, because after today, they won't think that anymore. Let's set the stage properly, because most coverage skips this part. For months now, there has been a slow, grinding conflict building between the United States and Iran. On paper, it looks like a mismatch. America has the largest defense budget on the planet. It has stealth aircraft, satellite networks, and more firepower than most alliances combined. Iran, by comparison, has an aging air force, a battered economy, and a government under constant pressure at home. If you only looked at raw numbers, you would assume this fight is already decided. But wars are not decided by raw numbers. They are decided by what each side can sustain, what each side is willing to risk, and who understands the other side's weaknesses better. And that is exactly where this story gets interesting. Because reports now suggest that Iran has spent the last several years quietly building something that most Western analysts underestimated. A layered air defense network, upgraded with Chinese technology, designed specifically to make American air dominance, upgraded with Chinese technology, designed specifically to make American air dominance
far more expensive than anyone expected.
It also helps to remember that wars like this rarely start suddenly. They build slowly, through years of smaller confrontations, proxy skirmishes, and quiet arms transfers that barely make headlines until the moment they suddenly do. By the time most viewers hear about a dramatic strike or a downed aircraft, the groundwork for that moment was usually laid months or even years earlier. In defense ministries and shipping routes, most people never think to watch. That word, expensive, is the key to everything that follows.
Not expensive in dollars only, though that matters too.
Expensive in aircraft, expensive in interceptors, expensive in political patience back home. And when a war becomes expensive in all three of those ways at once, something interesting happens. The side that looks weaker on paper can start to win the war of attrition without ever winning a single decisive battle. Here's the central tension of this entire story. The United States built its military doctrine around one core assumption: air superiority. Take control of the skies first, and everything else becomes possible. Take control of the skies first, and everything else becomes possible.
Precision strikes, safe troop movement, protected supply lines.
It has worked for decades, in conflict after conflict, against opponents who could not seriously challenge American aircraft. Iran studied that doctrine closely, and instead of trying to match American air power plane for plane, which would be impossible, Iranian military planners appear to have taken a completely different approach. Build a web of layered defenses on the ground, mix older Russian aero systems with newer Chinese-backed technology, spread them out, hide them, make them mobile, mix older Russian aero systems with newer Chinese-backed technology,
spread them out, hide them, make them mobile,
and force any attacking aircraft to fly through a gauntlet instead of an open sky. This is not a new idea in military theory. It is often called anti-access, area denial strategy, and it has been used by smaller powers for years to blunt the advantage of larger militaries. What is new here is the scale and the sophistication. According to defense analysts tracking the region, Iran has reportedly received advanced radar systems, upgraded surface-to-air missile platforms, and portable anti-aircraft systems capable of threatening even modern fighter jets.
Some reports even suggest that at least one advanced American aircraft has been damaged or downed during recent operations.
A claim that, if accurate, would represent a significant shift in how this conflict is understood. Think about what that actually means. For decades, American pilots have operated with the assumption that enemy defenses in this region were outdated and largely symbolic. If that assumption is now false, even partially false, then every mission planning calculation changes. Every strike package needs more support aircraft. Every pilot needs to fly more cautiously. Every pilot needs to fly more cautiously. Every commander needs to accept slower, costlier operations instead of fast, decisive ones. This is the trap. Not a trap made of steel and wires, but a trap made of math. American air power depends on speed and dominance. Iran's strategy, whether by design or necessity, is built to slow that speed down and chip away at that dominance, one mission at a time. Now let's talk about the numbers, because this is where the story becomes almost impossible to ignore. Modern air defense interception is not cheap. High-end interceptor missiles, the kind used to shoot down incoming threats, can cost anywhere from several $1 million to well over $10 million per unit, depending on the system. Meanwhile, The offensive missiles and drones being used against American assets in this conflict are, by comparison, dramatically cheaper to produce and deploy. That imbalance matters more than most people realize. Picture two boxers in a ring, except one boxer gets tired twice as fast as the other for every punch thrown. Even if that boxer is stronger, even if he lands harder hits, eventually his arms grow heavy. Eventually he has to slow down just to survive the fight.
That is the position American forces increasingly find themselves in this theater.
Every intercepted missile costs a fortune. Every mission burns through limited stockpiles of advanced munitions. And stockpiles, unlike headlines, do not refill overnight. Independent research groups tracking defense spending have pointed out that continuous operations at this intensity draw down advanced interceptor inventories far faster than industrial production can replace them. That is not speculation. That is basic supply chain reality.
Precision weapons take months, sometimes years, to manufacture at scale.
You cannot simply order more Patriot interceptors or advanced missile systems and expect them to appear the next week. So here is the uncomfortable question hiding underneath all of this. What happens when a superpower starts running low on the exact tools it needs to maintain its advantage in the middle of an active conflict, with no easy way to resupply quickly? That is not weakness in the traditional sense. Nobody is suggesting American forces are being overrun.
But it is a different kind of vulnerability, a quieter one.
The kind that does not show up in a single dramatic battle, but slowly reshapes the entire balance of a war. And this is where the Chinese backing becomes so important to understand. It is not just about supplying weapons. It is about supplying a strategy. China has spent years studying how to counter advanced Western militaries without matching them plane for plane or ship for ship. Layered, mobile, relatively low-cost air defense systems are a core part of that thinking. By transferring elements of that approach to Iran, whether through direct technology transfer, technical assistance, or simply shared design philosophy, China gains something valuable without ever putting its own soldiers at risk. It gets to watch its defensive concepts tested in real combat conditions against one of the most advanced militaries in the world, and it gets to learn from every single outcome. Now, before we go further, I want to be fair to the other side of this argument, because a good analysis does not just pick a conclusion and defend it. It tests itself against the strongest possible counterpoint. Here's the strongest case for the opposite view,
the case that says American power is still fully in control of this situation.
The argument goes like this. Even if interceptor stockpiles are being drawn down faster than expected, the United States still has an industrial base larger than almost any nation on Earth. Production can be accelerated. Allies can contribute additional systems.
And even a costly campaign can still succeed if the political will exists to see it through.
On top of that, no single downed aircraft or damaged system changes the overall balance of power in a dramatic way. One incident, even a serious one, is not the same thing as a strategic collapse. A single symbolic setback can be absorbed by a force this large without changing the ultimate outcome. This argument deserves real respect. Industrial capacity matters. Alliances matter. Resolve matters. There have been conflicts throughout history where a stronger power absorbed early losses, adjusted its strategy, and still emerged with its core objectives intact.
So it would be dishonest to pretend this counter-argument has no weight at all.
But here is where that argument runs into trouble when you look closely at the details. Industrial capacity is not the same thing as immediate industrial output. Ramping up production of advanced interceptor systems is not something that happens in weeks. It typically takes many months, sometimes years, to significantly increase manufacturing output for highly specialized components, rare materials, and precision engineering that cannot simply be rushed without compromising quality and reliability. So even if the long-term industrial advantage clearly favors the larger power, the short-term reality, the reality that matters most in an active, ongoing conflict, still favors whichever side is burning through resources more slowly. Allied contributions help, but they also come with political complications of their own. Every additional country that joins a coalition brings its own domestic pressures, its own economic vulnerabilities, and its own list of targets that opponents can now credibly threaten. Expanding a coalition does not simply expand strength. It also expands the number of pressure points an opponent can exploit, as neighboring countries begin to feel the direct costs of a conflict they were previously watching from a distance. And political will, the final piece of this counter-argument, is exactly the piece we already spent time examining. Resolve is not something that exists in a vacuum. It is shaped constantly by public opinion, economic pressure, and the approaching pressure of elections. A leader can want to see a conflict through completely and still find that domestic political conditions make that increasingly difficult to sustain without visible, decisive progress that reassures a skeptical public.
So, while the counter-argument is intellectually serious, It tends to underestimate
exactly how much time pressure, economic pressure, and political pressure can compound together during a prolonged, unclear conflict. Strength on paper is real, but strength that cannot be sustained at an acceptable cost for an acceptable length of time starts to function very differently in practice than it does in theory. Let's pause here for a second, because I know a lot of you are watching this and thinking about what happens next. That's exactly the kind of question worth exploring together.
If you're finding this useful, do me a favor and tap that subscribe button.
Then drop a comment telling me which part surprised you the most. I read every single one, and it genuinely shapes what we cover next. Let's go deeper into what this means, because the story does not stop at military hardware. It extends into politics, economics, and the psychology of how wars actually end. Every war has two audiences. There's the enemy on the battlefield, and there's the public back home. Sometimes the second audience matters more than the first. A military can be technically winning every individual engagement and still be losing the larger war, if the people back home stop believing the fight is worth the cost. This is where the trap becomes even more dangerous, because it is not just a military trap, it is a political one. And when a war drags on without a clear, easily explainable victory, public support erodes. People start asking simple questions. What are we actually trying to achieve? When does this end? Why are prices going up at home while soldiers are fighting overseas?
These questions do not need sophisticated answers to be powerful.
They just need to be asked often enough by enough people for political pressure to build. And here's something crucial to understand about how modern wars are perceived. It is not enough to win strategically if you cannot also win the narrative. A leader who appears strong but cannot clearly explain the mission risks looking indecisive. A leader who appears weak risks looking like they are losing control of the situation entirely. Either way, the political cost of a long, expensive, unclear conflict tends to rise the longer it continues, especially as elections approach and economic pressures at home start competing with military priorities for public attention. This creates a strange kind of trap for any political leader involved in a prolonged conflict like this one. Stopping the fight can look like admitting failure. Continuing the fight can look like stubbornness. Escalating further can trigger economic shocks, especially around energy prices, that hurt ordinary people at home far more directly than any battlefield outcome ever could. There is no comfortable option. Every path forward carries a political price tag. Meanwhile, the side absorbing the pressure, in this case, the side using layered, lower-cost defense strategies, does not need to win outright. It simply needs to survive long enough, cost enough, and create enough uncertainty that the other side's domestic patience runs out first. This is one of the oldest ideas in the history of asymmetric conflict. You do not have to defeat a stronger opponent in open battle. You simply have to make the fight too expensive, too uncertain, and too politically costly for them to continue. There is also a quieter economic dimension running underneath all of this, one that rarely gets attention. Energy markets are deeply sensitive to instability in this region. Even the perception of prolonged conflict can push oil and shipping costs higher around the world. And when fuel prices rise, and that pressure does not stay contained within military budgets, it moves directly into everyday households, into grocery bills, transportation costs,
and inflation figures that ordinary people feel every single week.
A war that started as a distant, faraway story on the news can very quickly become something people feel in their wallets, and that shift changes public patience dramatically. At the same time, there's the question of who benefits quietly while two larger powers exhaust each other. Historically, in almost every prolonged proxy-style conflict, there tends to be a third party watching from a distance, absorbing economic advantages while the two exhausted sides bear the cost.
Cheaper energy deals, expanded trade influence, and deeper political relationships
often flow toward whichever outside power is supplying the technology and support behind the scenes, all without that outside power ever having to send a single soldier into direct combat. That is one of the most underappreciated aspects of modern proxy conflicts. The side supplying the strategy from a distance often walks away with the most durable long-term gains, while the two sides doing the actual fighting absorb nearly all of the cost. So when we step back and look at the full picture, what we are really watching is not a simple story of win and lose. It is a much more complicated structure, where military strategy, domestic politics, economic pressure, and international positioning are all tangled together, each one influencing the others. Before we go further, I want to pause again, because this next section matters, and I don't want you to miss it. If this kind of clear, layered breakdown is helping things click into place for you, share this video with one person who's been confused by all the noisy, contradictory headlines out there. That single share does more for this channel than any algorithm trick ever could. Let's now talk about what actually happens from here, because understanding a trap is only useful if it helps you predict. Historically, When a stronger military power finds itself stuck in a costly conflict against a well-prepared opponent, there are usually only a few realistic paths forward. The first path is dramatic escalation.
Expand the target list, hit infrastructure that was previously considered off limits.
Accept the economic and political risk of a much larger, more visible conflict, in hopes that overwhelming force finally breaks the other side's will to continue. This path can work, but it carries enormous risk. It can trigger exactly the kind of energy price shocks and public backlash that make the political trap even worse. It can also draw in other regional players who feel threatened by that escalation, expanding the conflict in ways that become very difficult to control.
The second path is negotiation.
Accept that outright victory is not realistically achievable at an acceptable cost, and instead pursue some kind of face-saving settlement. This is often the quieter, less dramatic option, but it comes with its own political danger. Negotiating from a position that looks weaker than expected can be framed by opponents at home as surrender, even when it is actually the more strategically sound choice. Leaders often resist this path specifically because of how it will be perceived, even when it is objectively the wiser move. The third path, and honestly the most common one throughout history, is simply prolonged stalemate. Neither dramatic escalation nor meaningful negotiation. Just continued, grinding conflict, with occasional spikes in intensity, slowly draining resources and patience on all sides, until either exhaustion or an unrelated external event finally forces a change in direction. This path tends to be the most damaging one over time, because it combines the costs of military spending with the political costs of an unresolved mission, without ever delivering the clarity that the public wants. What makes this particular situation so worth watching closely is that all three paths appear to be in play, in different rooms, among different decision makers at the same time. Some voices are pushing for escalation, some are quietly exploring negotiation, and the actual observed pattern of strikes, careful, calibrated, avoiding extreme targets while projecting strength, suggests a strategy caught somewhere between all three options, unable to fully commit to any single path. This is often what a trap looks like from the inside. Not a dramatic collapse, but a kind of strategic paralysis, where every available option carries a cost that feels unacceptable. So decision makers end up choosing a middle path that satisfies no one completely and resolves nothing. Meanwhile, the side that built the layered defense strategy in the first place does not need a dramatic ending. Time itself is doing a lot of the work. Every week that passes adds more strain to stockpiles, more strain to political patience, more strain to public support back home.
And every week also gives outside observers more opportunity to study exactly how this defensive strategy performs,
learning lessons that could shape future conflicts far beyond this one. There is something almost quietly unsettling about that dynamic, once you really sit with it. A conflict that looks, from the outside, like a demonstration of overwhelming strength, can actually be functioning as a very expensive, very public demonstration of how that strength is worn down. Not defeated in a single stroke, but slowly, methodically, strained at the seams, in full view of the world.
If you want to track this yourself instead of waiting for headlines, watch these specific things.
Watch shipping traffic through the region's key waterways. When a blockade suddenly allows certain vessels through while restricting others, that tells you far more. It usually signals quiet, behind-the-scenes negotiations happening well outside the public eye. Watch which additional countries get pulled into direct participation. Every time a neighboring nation moves from observer to active participant, it becomes a legitimate target.
Widening a coalition can look like strength, but it multiplies the number of places where conflict can flare up.
Watch energy infrastructure specifically. Ports, pipelines, and export terminals are not just economic targets. They're pressure points that ripple outward into global markets within hours. A strike on energy infrastructure is often a clearer signal of intent than a dozen military strikes. Watch for silence just as closely as you watch for statements. When governments that would normally comment suddenly go quiet, that silence is rarely random.
It often means private conversations are already underway that are already shaping the next phase.
And finally, watch the calendar. Every prolonged conflict eventually collides with an election cycle. That collision changes behavior in ways that pure military logic never would. Decisions that look confusing strategically often make sense when you check the weeks until voters go to the polls. An opponent who understands that calendar holds a form of leverage that firepower cannot easily erase. Put those 5 things together, and you stop reacting to headlines one at a time.
You start seeing the pattern underneath them, the same pattern that connects a missile to a gas station price sign.
None of these things happen in isolation. They are all part of the same slow-moving structure. And that brings us to the real lesson buried inside this story about modern power in the 21st century. Overwhelming strength is not the same thing as unlimited strength. Even the most capable military in the world operates within limits of supply, patience, and cost. A smaller, well-prepared opponent does not need to match that strength directly. It only needs to understand where those limits sit and design a strategy that pushes against them patiently, repeatedly, without ever needing a single dramatic victory to make its point. That is the quiet, uncomfortable truth sitting underneath every headline about this conflict. The most dangerous traps are rarely the ones that spring shut in a single moment. They are the ones that tighten slowly, one calculated pressure point at a time, until the side that once looked unstoppable finds itself choosing between options that all feel like losses. So here is what I want to leave you with. Next time you see a headline describing overwhelming force, do not just ask who struck harder today. Ask a different question instead. Ask what it is costing them to keep striking at all. Ask how long that cost can be sustained. Because in modern conflict, the side that shapes the outcome is rarely just the side with the most firepower. It is the side that understands time, patience, and cost better than anyone else in the room. And if this breakdown gave you a clearer picture than anything else, that is why this channel exists. Stay curious, stay skeptical of easy headlines, and I will see you in the next one.